With the rise of modern low-wing fighters, the Italian Ministry of Aviation sought to stay competitive in the new arms race of the 1930s. To replace aging biplane models, they initiated a program to develop advanced fighter aircraft. The new plane was envisioned to incorporate metal components and, beyond its primary role as a fighter, would be capable of engaging ground targets as well. A request for proposals was issued to domestic aircraft manufacturers, resulting in several submissions. After careful evaluation, only the Fiat G.50 and the Macchi C200 were selected for production, while the other designs were rejected. The G.50 was a significant improvement over the older biplanes and a good design for the early stages of the war, but it quickly fell behind the more advanced fighters employed by the Allies. Despite its obsolescence, it remained in use in ever-dwindling numbers until the Italian capitulation in 1943. The history of the Fiat G.50 began in 1931, when Fiat established a new Aircraft Technical Bureau department with the aim of designing modern, all-metal aircraft. In the same year, Fiat recruited a young engineer, Giuseppe Gabrielli, who would later play a key role in the development of the G.50. In April 1935, following a request from the Italian Air Ministry for a new fighter aircraft, Gabrielli began working on the design. By September of that year, the initial design was complete and submitted to the Air Ministry. Impressed by the proposal, the Ministry approved the project. However, in January 1936, the Ministry revised the aircraft's requirements, deciding to focus solely on its role as a fighter. They sought to accelerate development, removing the inclusion of a bomb load and reducing the armament to 2 heavy machine guns. Despite the changes, Fiat proceeded with the project, which was officially designated as the G.50, also known by the name Freccia, with development carried out by its subsidiary CMA-SA. The prototype was ready at the beginning of 1937 and transported to the city of Turin for its initial testing. Its first flight took place on February 26, 1937. During these early tests, the test pilot identified several issues with the aircraft, particularly the strong vibrations during flight and the aircraft's tendency to spin. After undergoing a series of tests and subsequent modifications, the prototype was sent to the Italian Air Force Experimental Flight Center near Rome, where it was tested by military pilots. They encountered additional problems, particularly with the difficulty in managing the controls at high speeds and the aircraft's poor climbing ability. To address these issues, the Air Ministry ordered a second prototype. The second prototype made its maiden flight in October 1937. However, tragedy struck the following month when this prototype crashed, resulting in the death of the pilot. The combination of the accident and the prototype's subpar performance, which did not meet expectations, alongside the superior overall performance of the Macchi C200, threatened to shut down the G.50 project. However, as the CMA-SA works were already in the process of producing a batch of 45 G.50s, it was deemed wasteful to scrap the already produced tooling equipment. Therefore, the G.50 production was allowed to continue on the condition that the manufacturer addressed its flaws before full-scale production began. The G.50 made its public debut at the International Aeronautical Show in Milan in October 1937. Despite its rocky start, production continued, and between 774 and 791 G.50s, along with their variants, were ultimately built during the war. Production started in 1937 and continued all the way to 1943. The first batch of G.50s was assigned to the Experimental Fighter Group for further testing and pilot training. This unit, based near Rome, was commanded by Major Mario Bonzano, a highly decorated pilot ace from the Spanish Civil War. After an extended period of training and evaluation, the Italian Air Force High Command decided to deploy 12 G.50 fighters to Spain in January 1939 for combat trials. The G.50 fuselage was constructed from 4 angular-shaped longerons and 17 metal frames. The wing featured a centre section made of a steel tube connected to the lower fuselage and included 2 metal spars joined by ribs. The entire fuselage, wings and tail were covered with duralumin sheets, while the movable control surfaces in the wings and tail were covered in fabric. The engine was mounted on a tubular frame that was connected to the fuselage with 4 bolts. A fireproof screen was installed between the engine and cockpit to protect the pilot from fires in case of engine malfunctions or damage. The aircraft was powered by an 840 horsepower Fiat A74 RC38 engine, which allowed it to reach a maximum speed of 470 km an hour and had an effective range of 445 km. The engine drove an all-metal 3-blade propeller manufactured by Fiat. One significant disadvantage of using a radial engine was the considerable drag created by its large cross-section. To facilitate easy access for ground repair crews, several access doors were added to the engine and fuselage interior. The initial G.50 series featured an enclosed cockpit, which offered excellent rear visibility, but presented several practical issues, such as poor ventilation and being difficult to open, especially in an emergency. These problems ultimately led to the adoption of an open cockpit design in later models. The G.50 was equipped with inward retracting landing gear, while the rear tail wheel remained fixed. The landing gear was operated hydraulically for retraction and pneumatically for lowering. The primary armament consisted of 2 forward-firing 12.7mm Breda Safat heavy machine guns, each with 150 rounds of ammunition. These guns were mounted behind the engine and synchronized to avoid damaging the propeller. The Italians would adopt the G.50 for various roles before and during the war, resulting in 2 major variants: the Fiat G.50B, a 2-seat trainer, and the G.50 bis, an improved fighter variant. The initial modification of the Fiat G.50 aimed to create a training variant. At that time, low-wing fighters were a relatively new concept, and most air forces, including Italy's, were still operating older biplanes. Retraining pilots to fly the new fighters was seen as essential. The first 10 G.50 training aircraft were completed in 1940. By the time production stopped in 1943, around 100 had been built. This version was recognizable by its long glazed canopy with the rear cockpit open from the top. As the flight performance of the Fiat G.50 gradually became outdated, the Italian Air Force sought to justify continued production by requesting a series of improvements. The proposed modifications aimed at enhancing the aircraft's capabilities, including the addition of extra fuel tanks to extend its operational range, a redesigned rear fuselage and vertical tail surfaces for better stability, improved cockpit glazing for greater visibility, and armour plates behind the pilot's seat for added protection. Additionally, the tail wheel was made retractable, a change meant to reduce drag and enhance aerodynamic performance. This improved version was designated the G.50 bis. Despite the plans to enter production in 1938, delays occurred, and the first aircraft was not delivered for testing until late 1940. However, the overall performance of the G.50 bis remained almost identical to the previous model. Though developed as a fighter, the G.50 was also tested as a ground attack aircraft, but the idea was quickly abandoned. However, a certain number of G.50s serving in North Africa were nevertheless modified by adding bomb racks and were employed in this manner. Smaller numbers were also tested for use by the Italian Navy for reconnaissance purposes. However, this too did not progress beyond a small production run. The G.50 Volts was an intriguing attempt to improve its flight performance by using a German DB601A engine. With the installation of this engine, it was possible to redesign the front part of the aircraft to have a much better aerodynamic shape. 2 prototypes were built and tested in late 1941. After a mechanically troublesome start, the issues were resolved and the aircraft offered much improved maximum speed. However, given the interest in the new G55 project, work on this aircraft was abandoned. A group of 12 new G50 fighters arrived in January 1939 in Spain, having been transported by sea. Starting in March, this unit carried out flight patrols and fighter cover missions for bombers. By that time, the opposing air force had been almost destroyed. No G50 were lost in combat during the Spanish Civil War. At the end of this war, 11 operational fighters were given to the new Spanish fascist regime. In August 1939, the first units to receive this fighter were the 20th and 21st Air Groups stationed near Rome. By the time Italy entered the war, there were around 118 G50s available. Attempting to capitalize on the swift Allied defeat in Western Europe, Italy declared war on France on June 10, 1940. Most G50s saw limited action, primarily providing cover for Italian bombers during their attacks on Corsica in mid-June. To support the German air raids on Great Britain, a special unit was formed in late 1940 and sent to Belgium. For this operation, the 20th Group, equipped with fewer than 50 G50 aircraft, was selected. They reached Belgium in October 1940, losing 2 aircraft during transit. From November 1940 to January 1941, the G50s conducted numerous patrol missions but never encountered any enemy planes. By the end of January 1941, most Italian Air Force units had returned home, with little to show off. In October 1940, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Greece, deploying fewer than 80 Fiat G50 fighters for the campaign. Initially, the G50s were used primarily for ground strafing due to the near-total lack of the Greek presence in the air. However, the situation changed with the arrival of British forces in November, marking the beginning of the first air battles. Despite facing a formidable opponent in the form of the Royal Air Force, Gloucester Gladiators and Hurricanes, the Italian pilots, many of whom had gained valuable combat experience during the Spanish Civil War, managed to hold their ground and achieve some successes in the aerial engagements that followed. Due to significant discrepancies among sources, precise data on the losses for both sides remains unclear. As the G50s struggled to compete with the superior Hawker Hurricanes, they were gradually phased out in favour of the more advanced Macchi C-200 fighters. By the time of the invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941, the G50s were primarily relegated to bomber escort missions. The conflict concluded after just a few days of fighting, and unlike the Luftwaffe, the Regia Aeronautica faced little resistance in the skies. During the North African campaign, the first G50s were deployed near Tripoli by the end of 1940 and early 1941. The initial units to operate in Africa were the 151st, 152nd and 358th Squadrons, with a combined total of around 76 to 80 fighters. Before these units saw any action, they started suffering losses to the environmental factors. Incredibly, the Italian military leadership had failed to adequately test the G50 for desert conditions, not anticipating how sand would affect the aircraft's reliability. The engines quickly suffered from sand infiltration, which damaged internal components and led to many planes being grounded. The landing gear was similarly affected, with sand entering mechanical systems and causing frequent malfunctions. Consequently, a number of planes were taken out of action. In response, the Regia Aeronautica scrambled to modify the aircraft to make them more suited for desert operations. The G50 saw heavy fighting in North Africa, where it was used in various roles, including for air superiority missions as interceptors, bomber escorts and in the ground attack role. As the war progressed, the G.50 was predominantly used for ground attacks, equipped with a 100-kilogram bomb load. During 1941 and early 1942, despite receiving reinforcements, the losses of G.50 aircraft were mounting. At the start of 1941, only 20 planes were operational. This number increased to 80 by October, but dropped sharply to 35 by December of that year. The majority of these losses did not occur in aerial combat, but rather due to enemy ground and air attacks on airfields, as well as accidents. For instance, on the 19th of November 1941, British armour attacked the airfield at Martubi, resulting in the destruction of 18 G.50s from the 20th Group. By the year's end, the sole unit still operating the G.50 was the 12th Group stationed at Tripoli. By 1942, most of the G.50 fighters had either been lost or replaced by more advanced Macchi fighters. The surviving G.50s were relocated to secondary airfields in Sardinia, Greece and the Aegean. After late 1942, the remaining G.50 fighters in Italy were primarily relegated to training and second-line operations. Some surviving G.50s were allocated to equip the 158th and 159th Groups, both of which suffered significant losses during attacks on fortified Allied positions in Sicily. Within a span of just a few days, these two groups were effectively wiped out. Following the Allied invasion of Sicily, which commenced in July 1943, the Italian mainland became the next battleground. On the 8th of September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. By this time, fewer than 50 G.50 aircraft remained in service, with only 17 still operational. A handful of these fighters were utilised by the newly formed National Republican Air Force in northern Italy for secondary roles and training purposes throughout the remainder of World War II. Meanwhile, a few G.50s were also integrated into the Italian co-belligerent Air Force in southern Italy, which had aligned itself with the Allies. Besides the Italians, Finland acquired 35 of these fighters and deployed them during the Winter War and the Continuation War. The independent state of Croatia also received over 10 of these fighters in 1942. Some of these were captured by the Yugoslav partisans and briefly used during and after the war. The only surviving aircraft is today stored at the Belgrade Aviation Museum. The Germans also captured a few of them, but they saw limited use. Lastly, in the mid-1930s, China attempted to procure these fighters locally, but ultimately nothing came of this effort. That concludes our examination of the Fiat G.50 fighter. What are your thoughts on it? Do you believe the Italian ministry was right to approve its production, despite its somewhat underwhelming performance? Let us know in the comments. If you like what we do and want to see more, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. Also, don't forget to take a look at our extensive collection of articles on our website, plane-encyclopedia.com. Thank you.